Hey everyone, my name is Marshall, and in this video I'll be discussing some pivotal releases during the hair metal era. So if you're someone who's into hair metal or just getting into the genre, hopefully this will serve as a good guide into some albums that really impacted the scene. So here we go. So my journey with hair metal really begins in my early youth. My parents grew up in the 80s and early 90s, and so a lot of it was just being exposed to what they were listening to, going into the basement, stealing their cassette tapes or CDs. And as a guitarist, I really credit a lot of these hair bands for developing my skills as a guitarist. You know, a lot of these bands have very virtuosic, high caliber players. I learned a lot in terms of lead playing, writing riffs, phrasing, tone, the list goes on. And today I play in a band called Lethal Remedy, and even though we're not a hair band per se, we're very much influenced by the genre. And I have to pay my respect to all those great players I listened to growing up. And so with that, here we go. Okay, so let's talk about the different periods of the hair metal movement. All right, I like to break it off into three different waves. So you have your first wave, which is like 1981 through 1984, and that's like, of course, Van Halen, fronted by David Lee Roth, but you have early Motley Crue, early Rats, early Dokken, Quiet Riot. You know, it's very metal leaning at the time. It's not quite as poppy as it gets later on with Wave 2, which is more 1985 through 1988. And I'm thinking of early Poison, I'm thinking of early Cinderella, I'm thinking of, you know, some Dokken albums like Under Lock and Key or Motley Crue's Theater of Pain. It's very excessive, it's over the top, it's kind of watered down production at times. It's very excessive and poppy, right? And then you have your third wave of hair metal, which is, I'm going to say, 1989 through the end of 93, okay? And, you know, this is like when Guns N' Roses kind of comes to the forefront, right? So it kind of shifts from the very excessive, loud, glammy colors of the mid-80s into a lot of like street clothes and a lot of like punky attitude, you know. So I'm thinking of bands like Guns N' Roses and Skid Row. I'm thinking of Dr. Feelgood by Motley Crue again, bands of that nature. So with that, let's dive a little deeper into some of the albums from each of those waves. Okay, to kick things off, I have to talk about Van Halen's debut from 1978. And this features Eddie Van Halen and his incredible lead playing and riff writing, a lot of what influences a lot of the guitarists that come out of these 80s hard rock bands. This is kind of the benchmark for guitarists specifically and like riff writing, and David Lee Roth is kind of like the catalyst for the front man of the 1980s. You know, he's very flamboyant, he's got blonde hair, you know, he's the center of attention, you know. He is often credited with really establishing the frontman of the 1980s. The next album is actually a couple years later on. This is Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love from 1981, and it was remixed and re-released in 1982 when Motley Crue signed a record deal with Elektra Records. This album is very raw, it's very much punk rock, it's low budget, and it's fantastic. I mean, I think it's probably the most consistent songwriting-wise in terms of Motley Crue albums. It of course has the title track, Too Fast for Love, on it, which, I mean, even if Jimmy Page wrote that riff, he would be proud of that one. That's such a killer song. And it's got their live staple, Livewire. You would never go to a Motley Crue show and not hear the song Livewire in their set list. I've seen them a handful of times. They've never not played it once. A killer song, great album overall. It even has some great bonus tracks on this one. This is like off of the re-release off Motley Records, which happened in the late 90s. Some of the bonus tracks that were unreleased, such as Toast to the Town and Stick to Your Guns, are incredible. So definitely check that album out. It's a little more raw than like your Kickstart My Heart, but it's worth a listen. I'm also going to mention Quiet Riot's Metal Health. You know, this album is often credited to really bringing hair metal into the pop charts, right? You know, you have the cover song that they did, "Come On Feel the Noise," and the great title track, "Metal Health," leading the way with this album. This was a #1 album, and it might be the first hair metal band that went #1. I think that's a fact. And then, of course, there's the band Ratt. Now, I don't actually have their early metal albums with, you know, Round and Round and Wanted Man and Lay It Down, but I do have this compilation album which has a lot of those songs. And Ratt, again, is a very metal-leaning band and a very important and pivotal band in the beginning of hair metal, so definitely worth checking out. Okay, so that leads us to the second movement of the hair metal scene, which is, I said, 1985 through 1988. I'm thinking of Motley Crue's Theater of Pain, right here. This album overall, not that great, not as good as their first two albums, but it does feature Home Sweet Home, which is kind of like the power ballad that made it essential for all albums moving forward after the release of this in 1985. You had to have a power ballad on your album in order to be successful and to go platinum or multi-platinum. You had to get the power ballad on your album. If you didn't have it, you weren't going to be a big success. You couldn't play in the arenas. So this album right here, even though it's not the greatest album of all time, it definitely made a big impact. You know, they wore a lot of makeup during this era, again, making an impact stylistically. And then it has a great cover for Smoking in the Boys' Room. Outside of that, another great song is Louder Than Hell. But yeah, for this one, Home Sweet Home changed the game. Another band I'm going to talk about is Poison. Again, this is a very glammed out look, as you can even tell by the cover. They almost look like girls, right? And this is Look What the Cat Dragged In. Funny enough, the title track is actually pretty heavy, but the rest of the album is very poppy, right? It's very commercial hair metal, you could say. It's got I Want Action, it's got the power ballad, I Won't Forget You, and then of course it has the staple track, Talk Dirty to Me. You're not going to go to a Poison show and not hear that song. You still hear that on the radio today. And it's got some other killer tracks like #1 Bad Boy on here. Cry Tough is pretty cool. Again, this is a little bit more watered down production, you know, something that kind of changes once you get to the third wave or the third movement. But it's a great album nonetheless. You have bands like Cinderella during this time. This is their debut called Night Songs. They're a little bit more metal leaning on this one with some touches of blues here, but it's got some great tracks like Nobody's Fool, it's got Somebody Save Me, and it's got Shake Me, another one of their signature songs. You can just tell that they're pretty glammed out on the cover of this one here. Great band. It's actually my first hair metal show was the headliner was Cinderella, and it was right before they broke up. And of course, I'd be a fool if I didn't mention Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. They teamed up with songwriter Desmond Child on that album to pen the hits You Give Love a Bad Name and Living on a Prayer, but my personal favorite is Wanted Dead or Alive. And no, I somehow don't own this album yet. And I can't not mention Def Leppard's Hysteria. This album was massive. And again, it's very poppy, it's very overproduced, but in a good way. In fact, all of side one are singles. There's 5 tracks on side one, and all of them are huge hits. And then on side two, it just keeps going. You have Hysteria, you have Excitable, which is another great track, Love and Affection. This album is incredible. And then another band I'm going to mention is Whitesnake's self-titled release from 1987. This is a little bit more meaty. It's not quite as poppy or as fluffy as bands like Def Leppard or Poison or Cinderella at the time. It definitely has some balls, and I think that's all thanks to the great guitar work of John Sykes on this album. He lays down some killer riffs and probably has the best guitar tone out of the second wave of hair bands. The whole first side of this album is incredible. Of course, it has the huge power ballad, Here I Go Again. It has the incredible song, Still of the Night. And it has another very big power ballad, Is This Love? And also Give Me Your Love Tonight is another great rocker on this one. Killer album, definitely worth checking out if you like some of the heavier stuff. Now, before I get into some of the albums from the third wave, from 1989 through the end of 93, there's some pivotal albums that I think came out during the second wave that led to the third wave of music. They really led the stylistic change of the over-the-top, excessive, spandex and colors to more of the street and attitude of what became hair metal in the late 80s and early 90s. And so the first album I'm going to mention is Motley Crue again with Girls, Girls, Girls. You can see this album, they got motorcycles, they're wearing leather jackets here, they got like this street look and street attitude on this album, way different than Theater of Pain. And on side one they have Girls, 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 they have Wild Side, which is a killer track, killer hard rock song there, and it has Dancing on Glass, which is often overlooked. The interesting thing about this album is it really lacks a mega hit power ballad, even though it's super successful of an album. Now there is the song You're All I Need, which was considered the power ballad of the time, but it is not a love song. If you've seen the video, you know what I'm talking about. But it's also kind of a forgotten song. You're not going to go to a Motley Crue show and hear that song. You're not going to hear that song on the radio even. It's kind of been forgotten. The main two songs off this are the rock tracks, Wild Side and Girls, Girls, Girls. Incredible album, and I'm sure this was on repeat in every strip club in 1987. Now the next album I gotta talk about is Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. This album is full of attitude and aggression, and it's just a killer hard rock album. Of course, it has their mega hits in Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine, and probably the most famous hard rock song of all time, Welcome to the Jungle. But this whole album is insane. It's got great production, great guitar riffs, great guitar tone. It's just such a fantastic album, and it's really the catalyst for what leads to the next era of hair metal, or next period, I should say. Now the last album I'm going to mention that also came out in 1987 is Aerosmith's comeback album with Permanent Vacation. Again, not super excessively poppy or glammed out here. It's got some great tracks on it though, like Ragdoll. It's got Dude Looks Like a Lady. It's got the song Angel, which is the power ballad on this one. This is another great album. And I really think that this album, along with Appetite for Destruction and Girls, 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 is what leads to the next period of hair metal bands. Now I can't talk about the third wave of hair metal bands without mentioning probably the biggest band to come out of that period, which is Skid Row and their debut album, which is the self-titled release. This one has their three biggest hits, 18 in Life, Youth Gone Wild, and I Remember You. This album is incredible, and it's produced pretty well, for a early 1989 release, and it features Sebastian Bach on vocals, which, as far as I'm concerned, there's no one who can compete with this guy on vocals. Like, his vocals are incredible. And overall, this band has phenomenal chemistry, and you're not going to find a bad song on this album. Definitely check this one out. If Guns N' Roses and Bon Jovi had a baby, it would be this album. And as you may or may not know, those were the two biggest bands of 1989, and this album is just perfect combination of those two bands. It's not too excessively poppy like Bon Jovi is, but it's a little bit less raw and raucous than Appetite for Destruction. So it's got that perfect balance of like that poppiness, but also a lot of like attitude and hard rock riffs. So killer album here. And the last album I gotta mention from the third wave is Dr. Feelgood by Motley Crue. This album got perfect production. It was produced by Bob Rock, and it has incredible guitar tones. It has great bass tones by Nicky. The drumming by Tommy Lee is impeccable, and people don't want to admit this probably, but Vince Neil's vocal performance on this is fantastic, just as fantastic as everything else. And the title track on this one just crushes. It has the best groove, and it really represents what this album is about. Definitely check this one out. This is probably their most consistent album since their debut, Too Fast for Love, right over here. Great album. Okay, and with that, I'm going to conclude my video. Now, obviously, there's a ton of great hair metal bands and albums that I didn't get to in this one. Feel free to comment and let me know if there's anything that you want me to go over next time. And with that, I hope this served as a good guide for you on your hair metal journey. And until next time, rock on.